I was never much of an outdoorsy person. Sure, I grew up in a small town where everyone hunted or fished, but I always preferred staying indoors, losing myself in books or video games. That changed when my best friend, Mike, convinced me to go on a weekend camping trip to an isolated lake deep in the Appalachian Mountains. He said we needed to unplug and get some fresh air, and as much as I dreaded the idea, I figured I could use a break from my computer screen. We packed up Mike's beat-up Jeep with camping gear, a cooler full of beer, and some basic supplies. The trip to the lake took about 3 hours of driving, most of it on narrow, winding roads. The further we went, the more desolate it became. Trees crowded in on either side of the road, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the signal bars on my phone eventually disappeared altogether. The last hour was on a bumpy dirt path that seemed barely wide enough for the Jeep, and I found myself gripping the door handle tightly as Mike maneuvered around potholes and overhanging branches. When we finally arrived at the lake, I had to admit it was beautiful in a rugged, untouched kind of way. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the late afternoon sun like a mirror. The trees surrounding the lake were dense, their towering silhouettes casting long shadows over the campsite. Mike was all smiles, clearly excited to be out in the wilderness, and even I felt a sense of calm settle over me. We set up camp near the shore, pitching our tent and building a fire pit from rocks we found nearby. By the time we were done, the sun had started to sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. We cracked open a couple of beers, grilled some hot dogs over the fire, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful night. I was wrong. It started with a sound. At first it was faint, so quiet that I thought I imagined it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to carry on the breeze. I glanced at Mike, but he didn't seem to notice, too busy stoking the fire. I brushed it off as an animal in the distance, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, something common in these parts. But then I heard it again, closer this time, a wet, raspy sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mike looked up from the fire, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "That growl. It sounded like it came from the woods." Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "Probably just a raccoon or something. We're in the middle of the wilderness, man. Animals are everywhere." I wasn't convinced, but I nodded, not wanting to seem paranoid. We spent the next hour or so talking and drinking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, but whenever I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. The fire was dying down, and the temperature had dropped considerably. We climbed into the tent, zipped up the entrance, and settled into our sleeping bags. Mike was out in minutes, his snores filling the small space, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that sound, the way it had seemed to get closer, the way it had echoed in the stillness of the night. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was right outside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl was low and menacing, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I strained to listen, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it was big, much bigger than any raccoon or deer. I reached over and shook Mike awake. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" he mumbled, clearly annoyed. "Shh, I whispered. Listen. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the growl came again, louder this time, followed by a rustling sound that made my skin crawl. Mike sat up, his face suddenly serious. What the hell is that? He whispered. I don't know, I replied, my voice barely audible. But it's close. We sat there in the dark, listening as the sound grew nearer. I could hear something heavy breathing just outside the tent, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was stalking us. The fabric of the tent rustled, and I could see the faint outline of something brushing against it, something tall and hunched over. Mike reached for his flashlight and clicked it on, casting a beam of light across the tent. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow, something large and grotesque, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. But then it was gone, disappearing into the trees. What the hell was that? I gasped, my heart racing. I don't know, Mike said, his voice shaky. But we need to get out of here. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags and grabbed whatever we could, our phones, the car keys, the flashlight. We didn't bother packing up the tent or any of our gear. I could still hear it out there, moving through the woods, circling us. We burst out of the tent and sprinted toward the Jeep, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as Mike fumbled with the keys. I could feel something behind us, hear its heavy footsteps as it followed. I didn't dare look back. The air was thick with tension, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Mike finally managed to unlock the Jeep, and we threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut. He started the engine, and the headlights illuminated the trees in front of us. For a moment, everything was still. Then, just beyond the edge of the light, I saw it. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, with long, spindly limbs and pale, mottled skin that looked sickly in the harsh light. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It stood there, staring at us, as if deciding whether to come closer. Go, I shouted, my voice breaking. Mike didn't need to be told twice. He floored the gas, and the Jeep lurched forward, bouncing over the uneven ground as we tore down the dirt path. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the creature was gone, swallowed by the darkness. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, and even then, we didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Mike broke the silence. What the hell was that thing? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever it wasn't human, and I never wanted to see it again. We never went back to that lake. It started as a simple weekend trip. Me, my girlfriend Lisa, and our mutual friend Tom. We all needed a break from the daily grind, and Tom suggested we head out to Blackthorn Canyon, a remote spot a couple of hours' drive from the city. The place was a hidden gem, far enough off the beaten path that tourists rarely ventured there, but still beautiful enough to warrant a visit. I didn't think much of it at first, just another nature excursion, hiking, camping, maybe a dip in the river. But Blackthorn Canyon was different. It had a reputation, a quiet one. People didn't talk much about it, but when they did, it was always with an air of caution. I didn't know about the stories until we were on our way there. Ever heard of the Blackthorn Shadows? Tom asked, steering the SUV around a bend in the narrow road. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long fingers of light through the trees that lined the road. I was in the passenger seat, and Lisa was in the back, her head buried in a book. We had about 30 more minutes of driving to go. Nope, I replied. leaning back and watching the trees blur by. What is it? Like a local legend? You could say that, Tom said, a grin creeping onto his face. Apparently, people who camp out there sometimes see strange figures, shadows moving where they shouldn't. Some say they're lost spirits or something. Others think it's a creature, some kind of forest demon. Lisa looked up from her book, unimpressed. Is this one of those things you read on Reddit, Tom? He laughed. Maybe, but there's some truth to it. There's been a handful of reports about people disappearing in the canyon, even a couple of hikers who went missing for days and came back with no memory of where they'd been. I snorted. So what? We're going to be haunted by shadow monsters? Could happen, he said, smirking. Lisa rolled her eyes, and we didn't talk about it again. At least, not then. We reached the canyon just before dusk. The trailhead was marked by a small, weathered wooden sign that read Blackthorn Canyon in faded letters. Beyond that, the trail wound down into the canyon, the trees thicker and darker than I'd expected. The entire place felt secluded, almost claustrophobic, as if the forest itself was leaning in, watching us. We grabbed our gear and started the hike down. It wasn't long, just a couple of miles to the campsite Tom had picked out near the river. As we descended, the air grew cooler, the light dimming even faster under the canopy of branches overhead. I couldn't help but feel like something was off. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt path and the sound of the river in the distance. We set up camp as the last of the light faded from the sky. The river ran quietly nearby, and Tom built a small fire while Lisa and I pitched the tent. By the time we sat around the fire, the stars had come out, twinkling faintly through gaps in the canopy above. For a while, it was peaceful, even serene. We roasted some marshmallows, shared a few beers, and laughed about stupid things. But that sense of unease still lingered at the back of my mind. It wasn't until later, when the fire started to die down, that things took a turn. I don't remember who noticed it first, but it was Tom who spoke up. Did you hear that? Lisa and I both stopped, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the soft rush of the river. Then, there it was, a faint sound, like footsteps crunching on the forest floor, somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. I turned, squinting into the trees. Probably just an animal, I said, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I'd hoped. Tom stood up, scanning the woods with a frown. No, that sounded like footsteps. Lisa shifted uncomfortably, wrapping her arms around herself. This is starting to feel like one of those horror movies where the idiots go into the woods and never come back. I laughed, trying to break the tension, but even I felt a chill. Maybe it's just the shadows. Like you said, Tom. You scared yourself. Tom didn't respond. He just kept staring into the trees. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the firelight, a shadow moving between the trees, barely visible. But then I realized the firelight wasn't reaching that far. Whatever it was deeper in the woods, and it was moving. Do you see that? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. I pointed toward the edge of the trees, where something tall and dark was shifting between the trunks. It didn't look like a person, at least not any person I'd ever seen. The figure was too thin, too elongated, like it was stretched out unnaturally. Tom saw it too. What the hell? Lisa gasped, her hand gripping my arm. What is that? The figure moved again, closer this time, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. The fire suddenly felt small, inadequate against the looming darkness beyond it. I reached for the flashlight in my bag and flicked it on, shining the beam toward the trees. Nothing. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only empty space. No figure, no movement, just trees and shadows. But I knew what I'd seen. "We need to leave," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "I don't care if we hike out of here in the dark. We need to go now." Tom hesitated, but I could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Maybe it was just... Before he could finish, the sound came again. Louder this time. Closer. Footsteps. Unmistakable now. Crunching through the leaves, accompanied by a soft, raspy breathing. And then, just at the edge of the firelight, the figure appeared again. This time, we all saw it clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Its skin, or whatever it was, looked leathery, stretched tight over its frame. And its face. There was no face, just darkness, like a void where features should have been. It stood there, watching us, if something without eyes could watch. And then it moved. Fast, too fast for something that size, and vanished into the trees. We didn't wait. We grabbed our things, barely packing up, and sprinted up the trail. The figure always just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light. We ran until we reached the car, hearts pounding, and didn't stop until we were back on the highway. None of us have spoken about it since. We haven't been back to Blackthorn Canyon, and I don't think we ever will. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town in Colorado, I spent most of my childhood hiking, fishing, and camping with my dad in the mountains. So when my buddy Jake invited me on a weekend camping trip to a remote spot deep in the Rockies, I didn't hesitate. It was supposed to be just a typical weekend trip. Camp out, have a few beers, maybe do some fishing. But it turned out to be anything but ordinary. We left early on a Saturday morning, our gear packed into Jake's old pickup. The spot he'd chosen was a place called Dry Creek, a few hours' drive into the mountains. I'd never heard of it, but Jake swore by it, said it was a hidden gem, a place where few people ventured. The road to the campsite was rugged, winding through dense forests of pine and aspen. The further we drove, the more isolated it became. No cell service, no signs of civilization, just the thick woods stretching endlessly in every direction. We finally reached the trailhead in the early afternoon. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of fresh mountain air that makes you feel alive. We grabbed our packs and started the hike down the narrow trail that led to the creek. The path twisted and turned, descending into a valley where the trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. I remember thinking it was a bit eerie, but I pushed the thought aside. This was nature, quiet, peaceful, untouched. We reached the creek about an hour later and set up camp in a small clearing beside the water. It was a beautiful spot, with the creek bubbling softly nearby and the mountains towering above us. We spent the afternoon fishing, catching a few trout that we planned to cook for dinner. Everything seemed perfect. As the sun began to set, we built a fire and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly, and the woods around us grew dark and still. I remember feeling a strange sense of quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. But again, I told myself it was just the isolation. No other campers, no noise, just the vastness of the wilderness. After dinner, we sat around the fire, drinking beer and talking about life, work, whatever. The stars were out in full, a brilliant display above us, and for a while, everything felt normal. Then, just as Jake was in the middle of telling a story, I heard something, a sound that cut through the night like a blade. It was a whistle, not the kind of whistle you hear from a bird or the wind. No, this was different. It was slow, deliberate, and human. The sound was high-pitched, like someone was whistling a tune, but it was broken, disjointed, almost like the person whistling didn't know how to form a proper melody. I froze, staring into the darkness beyond the fire. Jake stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. He'd heard it too. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Jake shook his head, his eyes scanning the woods. "I don't know. Probably just the wind." But I wasn't convinced. The sound was too clear, too intentional. It came again, this time closer. A long, drawn-out whistle that seemed to echo through the trees. My heart started to pound in my chest. "Do you think someone's out there?" I asked, glancing at Jake. "There's no one out here," he said, though I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't sure. "We're miles from the nearest town, and we haven't seen anyone all day." Another whistle. This one was even closer, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the edge of our firelight. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Jake, maybe we should check it out. What if someone's lost?" He hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, let's take a quick look." We grabbed our flashlights and stepped away from the fire, the beams cutting through the inky blackness of the woods. The whistling had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. We moved cautiously, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, any hint of another person. But there was nothing, just the dark, endless forest. After a few minutes, Jake stopped and turned to me. "This is stupid, man. There's no one out here. Let's go back to the fire." I nodded, though I still couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. We turned around and started back toward the campsite. That's when the whistle came again, but this time it was different. It was right behind us. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees. My pulse was racing, my skin cold with fear, but there was no one there, just shadows and trees stretching out into the blackness. "Jake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Run," he said, his voice trembling. We took off, sprinting back toward the fire as fast as we could. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind us, heavy and slow, as if something was following us, stalking us. My heart was in my throat, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run faster, to get away. We burst into the clearing, nearly tripping over the fire pit. I spun around, breathing hard, expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But again, there was nothing, just the stillness of the woods and the dying crackle of the fire. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting, listening. The whistling had stopped. "I think we should leave," I said finally, my voice shaking. "Now." Jake didn't argue. We packed up our gear in record time, dousing the fire and throwing everything into our packs. We didn't even bother with the tent. We just grabbed what we could and started hiking back up the trail, our flashlights bouncing as we hurried through the darkness. The hike back to the truck felt like it took hours. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch made me jump. I kept expecting to hear the whistle again, to see something moving in the trees behind us. But the woods were silent. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear into the back and jumped in. Jake started the engine, and we peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the narrow road. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the tension in the cab thick and suffocating. It wasn't until we were back on the highway, miles away from Dry Creek, that Jake finally broke the silence. "You heard it too, right?" he asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I heard it." We didn't talk much after that. We drove straight home and never went back to Dry Creek. I don't know what we heard that night, or what was out there in the woods, but every now and then, when I'm alone in the quiet, I swear I can still hear that whistle. Slow, deliberate, haunting, and I never want to hear it again.